Our product is a product that has to go through a certain set of criteria before it can be marketed. The average farmer can't just put his lambs on the back of the ute and go to Woolworths and say, here, let's buy these. So right across the industry, we need a profitable supply chain. To finish up as a consumable product, Michelle's going to tell us about how the plant at Gundagai is using these technologies to give them the leading edge, which is what I think every business is hoping to get at, to the leading edge. I've just got to move my position on the page. Michelle's childhood growing up on a dairy and sheep farm in South Gippsland ignited her passion for agriculture and a career path focused on animals. She studied a Bachelor of Animal Science at the University of Melbourne, followed by a PhD in the effect of perennial ryegrass toxins on sheep. After spending many years undertaking teaching and research at the university, Michelle took the leap into industry 9 years ago and is now supply chain manager at Gundagai Meat Processors, leading the livestock buying team at Gundagai Lamb. Michelle's role encompasses everything from tracking current livestock markets to working on projects to improve the feedback we give our producers, to working with producers to understand their feedback and educating them on the tools available to them to improve carcass results. Michelle?
Might need that one. Yeah. I don't have a big booming voice or anything, so I will need this. That was very long, I'll have to shorten it. But thank you. But I'd just like to thank Isabel for asking us to do a presentation here today. And to thank Isabel for all of her support as well, because she's been a big supporter of ours and she's been a really good sounding board when we've needed someone to get some advice from on different things. So today I'm going to be talking about the importance of genetics to a progressive meat processing company. And I'm going to do that by firstly just giving you a bit of insight into Gundagai Meat Processors' objective carcass measurement technology journey and how we've brought all that together into the Gundagai Lamb grid. I'll then talk a bit about genetic priorities, or how we see those as a processing company, and what our grid signals really mean for the consumer, but also you as producers as well, because we see that as a bit of a crossing point. And then I'll spend a bit of time just looking to the future, so what's coming. So for those of you who aren't aware, Gundagai Meat Processors installed the first hot DEXA. So DEXA is a dual energy X-ray absorptiometry machine, and it sits on the end of our slaughter floor. So each of the carcasses moves through that machine and it measures the amount of lean meat yield, fat percentage and bone percentage on every single carcass. And it's really important just to make sure we're all clear on that, because it's not dressing percentage and we often get questions around that getting confused. So it does tell us the composition of each carcass. We also have an MEQ probe, and we worked closely with the MEQ team during COVID and their accreditation of that probe. But the MEQ probe also sits on the hot side of our floor. So it actually sits just before the hot scales. And it tells us the amount of intramuscular fat that's in the loin muscle of each and every carcass that moves through our floor. We also have hook tracking. So we've heard a bit from Pete, and there'll probably be a few crossovers in message, but we also have hook tracking on our floor. So that means we have an RFID chip in each and every single hook on our floor. So every time a carcass passes past an RFID reader at a point where we need to collect a piece of information, that piece of information goes into the back end and attaches itself to that individual carcass. And that's really important for any objective carcass measurement technology. We also have a health for well system. So we record the diseases and defects on an individual carcass basis as well. And then we take all of that information that's been measured hot on the floor, and we can make decisions about it. We've got fully automated chillers, which enable us to be able to make decisions on how we sort carcasses before they've entered the boning room. So for those of you who haven't seen our grid, I thought I'd just give you a little look at it. So it's probably the first value-based marketing grid for lamb. And as you can see, there's 5 different categories for lean meat yield at the top. So anything below 55% is... Oh, I've done it again, guys. Sorry, I always do this. They're going to be laughing at me. Anything under 55% lean meat yield is a carcass that we deem too fat. Anything that is over 68 is too lean, and our sweet spot sits between 59 and 66%. We also have 5 categories for carcass weight, so anything under 20 kilos is too light, anything above 34 kilos is too heavy, and 24 to 32 kilos is our sweet spot once again. All lambs that grade a Gundagai Lamb quality score over 5 receive an 80 kilogram premium. And that's above that price that's given there. In terms of the Gundagai Lamb quality score, just to give you a little background on this one. So the Gundagai Lamb quality score is largely made up of intramuscular fat, and it's a proprietary algorithm that's been developed in-house. So it's largely weighted towards intramuscular fat in a carcass, but it also takes into account the amount of lean meat yield and also if there are any animal health issues with that carcass. So if there's anything that's manageable, treatable or preventable on farm, we do deduct 1 point for animal health issues off that score. You'll see anything with a really low IMF, so if you look at sort of the 1% IMF category, and a really fat carcass, they're going to get a really low GLQ score. The black box here is where all of our GLQ5 plus numbers come into play. But if that carcass is leaner, that's not going to improve the score all that much. If we have a carcass with an IMF of 9%, but it is overly fat, it will never make it into the GLQ5 plus brand. We deem that it's too fat and too inefficient, and we don't want to be encouraging producers to be over-fattening lambs to try and get higher IMF values. And obviously we have our higher values in that green square. So when we've got above average IMF and we have a good amount of lean meat yield, that's where you get a GLQ5 plus score. We're not trying to be the Wagyu of lamb, so we're really just trying to make sure that we're segregating product based on quality to give our consumers a consistent eating experience. Overlaying all of that is Meat Standards Australia. So all of our Gundagai lamb carcasses have to come from Meat Standards Australia accredited farms, and that's really looking after the other side of eating quality. So intramuscular fat, lean meat yield, that's all one part of it, but making sure that we're managing stress in animals leading up to slaughter, that they've got enough fat cover, is really important to make sure that we're not cold shorting carcasses through the plant as well. We're also now incorporating the cut by cook MSA model into our systems as well. So at the moment it's just pathways, but we are incorporating the cut by cook model as well. Alright, so the importance of genetics. So if we have a look at this as the value chain, so the consumer is the only one putting that value into the value chain, and we have to make sure that we're looking at that consumer feedback and taking that on board when we're making genetic decisions on farm. And this is really just a bit of acknowledgement of what your priorities are. So really, your first priorities, obviously, from a production point of view on farm, are around fertility, survival and growth. They're your big profit drivers. You need to actually have lambs to sell out the other end. And obviously, that's really important for everyone. From a finishing point of view, you need to make sure that they're growing, but they're growing efficiently. So you've got good feed conversion efficiency during that finishing stage. For us as processors, our top priority really is the consumer. So we want the consumer continuing to want to buy our product. And in particular, if we're expecting a premium for that product, we want to make sure they're coming back again and again and they're having that consistent eating quality experience. But also saleable meat yield is big for us. So making sure that we're not processing overly fat carcasses and not able to put that product into a carton at the other end, that can be a big expense for us as a processing company. If we think about distribution, so I haven't put them up here, but just we think about distribution, that's more things like packaging and shelf life. Obviously the chef is going to have priorities around what they want to be able to put on a plate for a consumer. But it all really comes back to that consumer feedback so that we can put out better genetic signals. So what does the consumer actually want? Well, if we think about it, it's really around consistency. So they want consistency in cut size, so they're not going to the supermarket and are not able to buy a leg that's going to fit their budget or feed their family. They don't want to be going to the restaurant and getting inconsistent cut sizes when they're going and ordering something at a premium. They want consistent eating quality as well, obviously, and we should always be prioritising that for them so that they're coming back and they're continuing to buy our product. But also consistent cut composition. So they don't necessarily want something with a tiny little eye muscle area or with way too much fat or that's too lean as well. So what are your genetic signals and what are we doing as a processor to signal that to you? Well, it all really comes back to our grid. So if we have a look at our grid in relation to cut size, the weight of that carcass is a really good proxy for that, along with lean meat yield, which makes that even more accurate. But if we think about cut size coming from an under 20 kilo carcass, they're going to be quite small. Those carcasses are probably going to be a bit underfinished. Anything over 34 kilos, and we've got cuts that aren't fitting into bags and into cartons that are hard to process and not necessarily what the consumer wants. So our sweet spot really sits at that 24 to 32 kilo mark. So we're able to service customers like the US where they want a heavy rack, and back to the domestic market where they want something that's obviously a little bit lighter than that. But that's how we signal that, obviously, through our grid. In terms of eating experience and have consistency in eating experience, it's really about grading lambs and grading them based on our Gundagai Lamb quality score. So obviously there's a price premium in our grid that does that, and because we're measuring everything hot, we can then sort those carcasses into the boning room and sell them at a premium. If we think about cut composition and we use lean meat yield across the whole carcass, that's how we're signalling this to you. So anything overly fat's under 55, anything overly lean's over 68, and really that sweet spot 59 to 66% is producing about what we want in terms of lean meat yield. Of course, there are things that we don't signal in our grid because we can't measure them. But I thought it would be good to just have a little talk about what could come in future or what we're thinking about around cut composition in general. So Claire's thumb is in this first picture here. Thank you, Claire, for thumb modelling for us. But that's an example of eye muscle area that's really small. That eye muscle area is about as big as Claire's thumb. So if you're a consumer and you're buying a high quality rack with that size eye muscle area, you're probably not going to be overly happy about it. If we think about cut composition that we don't want in overly fat lambs, and it's actually a little bit hard to see, this was off Jake's phone. It's a fantastic photo because it is just like a bad example. You can see here, there's a bit of a whiteboard behind it, but you can see how fat that carcass was. Now that's a wastage to the supply chain. So at some point someone's cutting that off. It's probably us, but if that makes its way any further, you're not going to pick that up if you're in the supermarket or at the butcher. You're not going to be happy if you're cutting it off on a restaurant plate. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to avoid, along with anything that's too lean. So it's a really good example of something that's far too lean. So that's probably not going to have been MSA accredited lamb because it's got too little fat covering it, and it would have cold shortened and it would have been a bad eating quality experience for the consumer. So these are the things that we're trying to avoid. What do we want? We want something like this. So something with a lovely big eye muscle area with some nice IMF in there and a good coverage over that cut. So we won't see cold shortening happening, a nice big eye muscle area for the consumer. That kind of thing is what we are after. I'm going to just switch now onto the future, and I'm going to take a few different approaches to this. So when I was talking to Isabel, she was asking me to talk about lots of different things, so I've tried to put it all in here. But the first is really what will not change. So I don't think in future there's going to be a change to us wanting, higher IMF and that being balanced with lean meat yield. I think that's going to continue because it's what's essentially best for us as an industry to be able to be putting good eating quality product into the market. So I don't think that's going to change, even though they're antagonistic to each other. I think we'll still be chasing that. I think something else that we did talk about was really carcass weight staying steady. So we've probably seen over the last 15 or 20 years that carcass weight has trended upwards, and we've seen carcass weight increasing. We don't foresee that that's going to continue to trend upwards. I think that we're in a good place now in terms of plant infrastructure. So plants would potentially need to make some big changes to be able to process much heavier carcasses and to see that continue to trend upwards. So we're probably in a good space in terms of carcass weight, and that's staying steady. But I think what's coming, and the thing that we talk about, is really eye muscle area. So when we look at those racks that have those tiny elongated eye muscles, it's something that we haven't really done a lot of measurements on, and we're looking at how we can actually measure that objectively on each carcass that comes through the plant. So we can at first give that as feedback so that you know where you're sitting with your eye muscle area. It's something that we don't have a great understanding of, but I think it's something that we're currently looking into being able to measure, possibly through the DEXA, so it's pretty exciting. Something that I did speak to Isabel about was just about where we're going with our GLQ bonus. So in terms of our GLQ bonus, we started off in July 2020. This is probably best explained in timeline because it was sort of how I thought about it. But in July 2021, we paid 50 cents per kilogram IMF bonus, and that is when our value-based marketing grid first came out. And would have been irresponsible of us to put a signal out there around lean meat yield and increasing lean meat yield without putting a signal out there around eating quality. So that's how we ended up with an IMF bonus. We wanted to make sure that eating quality was being looked after as well, and we were able to measure it. But it was an investment. We weren't doing a lot of sorting back then, so it was really an investment by the brand in eating quality. By September 2022, we switched that to our GLQ bonus, so it stayed at 50 cents and was still an investment. And then by October 2022, we decided to increase it a bit, so we're up to 80 cents by that point, still an investment. In our 2023-2024 year, we had total sales for our GLQ5 Plus product at $1 million, so gross sales. And really pleasingly, in February of this year, in just 1 month, we did 1.25. So we've really seen sales grow recently in terms of our GLQ5 Plus product, which is obviously paying for that investment that we made in that bonus. And one question we do get is around when's it going to increase? I think for the 2025-2026 year, it will stay steady. And if there's any growth in future, it will be with demand. So it will be with that sales demand. So we'll wait and see what happens next week when Trump makes his decision around what's happening in the US. But I think it'll stay steady for a while. I think it's paying for itself now. It could move in future, but yeah, we're not at that stage yet. Another question that we get a lot is, when will all of this become mainstream? And it's really hard for us to answer that as a standalone brand or processing plant. But we thought, actually sat down with Will and we did this together. He was like, oh, Michelle, we can answer it like this. So hopefully this sort of gives us all some perspective on how well we're actually doing in the lamb industry. But if we look at when the introduction of MSA pathways occurred with beef, that was way back in 1998. And then it took another 2 years for the cut-based model to be released. 3 years later, there were early adopters of company grading, so 2003. But mainstream adoption of grading didn't happen for another 8 years to 2011. So there was a bit of a lag time with beef in terms of when that adoption of grading for MSA really came about in a more mainstream way. I was talking to Pete, I think he's left now, but we were trying to figure out when the earliest grids came out in beef, and he sort of pointed towards maybe 2003 in Western Australia when they first started grading. They were doing an in or out system, so back in 2003, and really didn't become mainstream until 2013. So there was sort of a 10-year lag to when it was really being uptake in beef. So I think we're doing really well in lamb. Obviously, introduction of MSA pathways happened in 2007, and there was such a big, still now the cut space model hasn't been released because there hasn't been a plant that's fully taken it on yet. But really the big lag in time was the need for objective carcass measurement technology to come on board. But we did release our GLQ score in 2022 and started sorting on that in a small way back then. In terms of when there's mainstream adoption, if you're looking at the beef timeline, we could be 5 years away, hopefully. That's what you pointed to, Isabel. It's no longer than that. And we're probably the earliest grid that's out there. In terms of when the mainstream grids will come, who knows? But just, I guess, to give you some perspective in what we've seen in beef and sort of what's happening in lamb at the moment, I think there's been some early movers. There's a few different brands that are doing it. So key takeaways today. So you obviously have many genetic priorities on farm, but consistent product quality is really important for us as a processor so that we can deliver that to a consumer. So they keep on deciding to put money into the value chain, and they increase that over time because they're really happy with the product that they're getting. I think eye muscle area is probably coming, hopefully, if we can work out a way to measure it. And it will have its most high impact on that high quality product end there. I think lamb's moving along quicker than we think, but we still obviously, there's mainstream adoption still to come. But I think the future's exciting, everything that we've done with Gundagai Lamb, and I think with our increase in sales that we've seen over time, I think should give a lot of confidence that, the sales are there and it is possible. And giving feedback is the right thing to do. Thanks.
Okay, we've got time for a couple of questions, if there's any. Yeah, Terry?
Do you at this stage even discriminate against land on shear force, and or do you see a day in the future where you might pay?
Yeah, so that's a really good, I knew I'd get a question on shear force, that's all good. So obviously we can't measure it at the moment, we don't have a way to measure it, but it is an important factor, and we probably, for us, don't understand how it might be affecting our product. I think if there was a measure, then it would be something that we would be looking into and seeing how much does it impact us, and obviously it's an important part as well that we need to be looking after, but something that's probably a lot harder to be able to measure objectively at line speed.
Any other questions?
Why are you looking at eye muscle area instead of eye muscle bed?
Oh, that's a really good question. Probably because I think that's what we've had available to us through the technology that we've had. So we're not ultrasounding anything, we're looking at camera devices potentially that can look at a cut surface. So that's what we've initially looked at. And I would say I'm not too sure exactly how we're going to calculate eye muscle area yet, in all honesty. So it will be hopefully through the DEXA and through maybe prediction of cut weights and looking at the composition of different areas of the carcass to help us do that. So it's all a bit R&D still, but yeah, it's a good question because that's what you guys are obviously focusing on rather than eye muscle area. Yeah.
Isabel?
I have a question I know the answer to, but I think it's worth everybody hearing. The feedback that you give back to lamb producers, when that comes back to them and they breed and feed and provide lambs to you, how much of a difference does it make to the quality of lamb that they provide you on their second, third, fourth and fifth consignments, based on the fact that they now know what they've sent you in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we don't know yet, to be honest. I think that we're still really early in the early stages, but obviously if someone comes through and they don't get such great results, they don't come back. But if they're getting good results and they're coming back time and time again, and they're starting to make different genetic selection decisions, I think, out there to improve those results over time. But I think it's worthwhile remembering we've only been going for really 4 years now, so it's still pretty early.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Michelle.
No worries.
It's been enlightening for everyone in the room. We will break for afternoon tea now, and we'll come back with an industry panel discussion at 3 o'clock.